channel fucking broken or down for this
Really?
because yeah, it's copyright. This is like copyright information. The copyright page. So let me just first go and start by giving everybody, giving Thomas Sowell his plug. This is his book. This guy is really smart. One of my favorite authors. The name of the book is Ethnic America. What he's talking about in the book is just all the different groups of people that came to America, maybe why they're performing so well, why they're not doing the greatest, whatever else. But he goes at length. And what I love about him is everything that he says he's reading, or everything he's giving you through his books is actually, he has a footnote, right? And tells you where he got it from. So then you can go to that next level and go deeper and read more. It's not like reading some other people who don't, you don't know where they got the information. They're great wordsmiths, and they're saying a lot of big words, and they have all these grand ideas, but they don't tell you where the hell the ideas came from.
Gotcha.
So this is the cover page of Ethnic America, and I'm just going to skip down because I've read most of it, but we're just going to start with you know uh, um, Africa.
Hey, look. Hey, disclosure. Our opinions are not the opinions of Thomas Sowell.
That's it. That's it. But I get a lot of my opinions from this guy. So the blacks. He says black Americans were the only racial or ethnic group brought to America against their will. They came from a vast continent, larger than Europe, and initially spoke a great variety of languages and represented many different cultures. In more than 2 centuries of bondage, their many ancestral languages and cultures faded away, and the genetic differences were amalgamated together with a substantial mixture of Caucasian genes to produce the American Negro, a cultural and biological product of the New World, rather than a direct descendant of any given African nation or culture. Now, nobody's going to argue that because
Right.
that's a beautiful intro. We came from all these different tribes in Africa. But when we got over here, all these different tribes are just black people. So
Right.
we all mixed. And there was some raping going on, and like it or not, we become mixed also with Caucasians and Indians and other things. And that's the American experiment. So I think the introduction for that first paragraph is powerful. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think it's the truth as well. I mean, it's very candid. Like that is kind of part of our history and who we are. We're an amalgamation of different African people from different tribes and different cultures, and like you said, with European ancestry mixed in as well through rape and through consensual um, relations, and we are the byproduct of that. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
He goes on to say the Black Americans are thus among the oldest Americans, and their cultural heritage is one formed almost exclusively on American soil. In another sense, Blacks are among the newer Americans, entering the larger society as a free people with an independent existence of their own only in 1863 with the abolition of slavery. So I'll pause there because what he's saying is while we've been here longer than anybody else, we weren't given the rights of everybody else. So we were kind of held in bondage for that. Not kind of, we were held in bondage for a long time. And we're kind of Johnny come latelys to, uh, I guess, capitalism or whatever else, because that time that other groups of people had being capitalists, having to work for themselves, starving on the street, not having, any real safety net because America was a young country at that time. There was no safety net, was no welfare. So if you couldn't make it, you just couldn't make it. But we at that time, we were property, right? So we weren't used to that capitalist system. We're Johnny come latelys. I'll let you go ahead and talk.
Yeah, I will say this. He had mentioned that like we created this new culture. I, and I'm you may have to read that again. He was kind of talking about our culture and how it's new. I will say this though. Our culture does include remnants or vestiges of the different cultures from over in Africa. It includes vestiges, or it also includes like different European uh, cultural ideas. So I think our culture is also an amalgamation of all the different um, ethnic groups, tribal groups, that came together to make us. If that
Yeah.
makes
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, if that makes sense. So I think our culture is also an amalgamation of all those different, tribal cultures, the European culture, Native American culture, and things of that nature. Like we took a little bit from all those different cultures as well.
Yeah.
So they're kind of intertwined within our culture today, so to speak.
All right. So what he said was, he said, in more than 2 centuries of bondage, the many ancestral languages and cultures faded away, and the genetic differences were amalgamated to produce the American Negro, a cultural and biological product of the New World, rather than a direct descendant of any given African nation or culture. So what he's saying is, we are a product of the amalgamation. We're not a direct descendant of any given African nation or culture. Then he goes on to say, we're amongst the oldest Americans, and their cultural heritage is one formed almost exclusively on American soil. So our cultural heritage, we don't know the heritage of our ancestors the same way somebody from Ghana would know the heritage of their ancestors. So most of our stories, like you've seen it before, whenever we start talking about Black history, we almost always start in slavery, which isn't the right thing to do, but that's because so much of our history is here on American soil. Yeah. Oh man, I hope I didn't lose him. Did I lose him? I'm gonna kick him out and then try to get him back. Let's see. So let's go ahead and kick him out. I'm gonna send him the invite again. Dave, can you hear me? Because I can't hear you. I'm gonna eject you, but then I'm going to send you an invite. So I'm ejecting him, but then I'm going to send him an invite. So hold on one moment, YouTube Nation. We'll get him back. Invites posted. See if he'll come back in. So what? I don't think we're saying different things. I think he may have been a little bit confused about the way that I read it. But yes, Black people are, we're a little bit of everything, but we don't know where we're from. So we have to give credit to each one of these cultures that are on the continent and say that there are a lot of differences between those cultures. We can't claim any one of those cultures as our own, but we are an amalgamation of all those cultures. We took that and we carried it forward too. All right, because I got you back.
Yeah, sorry about that. My phone died. I'm on the wife's computer, so.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I was just telling the YouTube world, I hope it wasn't any confusion on that. Like what he is saying directly is, yes, that we have all these different African cultures, and we have to give those African cultures their credit because they are each different. Like if you're talking about the Igbos or the Hausas, they can both be from the same general area, but those are two completely different cultures. We cannot claim either one of those cultures as our own, but we can claim both of those cultures because we have remnants of them all.
Gotcha. So he's pretty much, I was saying the same thing that he was saying.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
But then I'm just going to read this last sentence. It says, in another sense, Blacks are among the newer Americans because we're newer Americans because we were enslaved. So we weren't participating in the society as a whole. Entering the larger society as a free people with an independent existence of their own only in 1863 with the abolition of slavery. Their arrival in urban America after massive internal migrations came even later. So that many, perhaps most Blacks today are only the second generation in the urban world in which they live. So think about grandma. Grandma came up to Chicago from where? From Mississippi.
Kosciuszko.
Kosciuszko, Mississippi. But that's not unique to our family.
Right.
That's you had the Great Migration happening in the 1930s. This book is probably written about 30 or 40 years ago itself. So when he's writing this, yes, we were just 1 or 2 generations out. Now we're 3 or 4 generations out of the South.
Right.
Okay. He said, in that sense, blacks are about where Irish were 100 years earlier. You see what he's saying there? The Irish were in the cities 100 years before the black people were.
Right.
Okay. In short, marking the starting point from which to measure the progress of black people in the United States is not easy and may vary with the particular issue. So that's a discussion in and of itself, realizing that we're not all starting, people talk about white privilege. Could they be confusing white privilege with a true white head start? We physically got to America earlier than everybody, but we physically got to Chicago much later than everybody. Most of us. However, even inside, so I'll read the next sentence just so you, while African Americans were amalgamated in America, Afro Americans were also differentiated, not according to ancestral cultures as among other groups, but according to different histories in the United States. So listen to this. He says, the time of acquiring freedom was a crucial differentiation. I.e., you had free black. You've always had free blacks in the country. Although most American Negroes were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, 500,000 were already free before then. These free persons of color had a history, a culture, and a set of values that continued to distinguish their descendants from other Negroes well into the 20th century. A third, small but important segment of the black population consists of immigrants from the West Indies. They too have had a different economic and social history from other blacks. Now, I think you've mentioned that before. So that's his introduction. Now, tell me that introduction just by itself isn't fire.
I agree with
So I'm gonna get to some of the more controversial parts then, or what you want to call controversial.
Now I do think that white supremacy or white privilege is the reason why it took so long for us to be freed, or for a large percentage of us to be freed, and to have equal opportunity and success. So I think that our enslavement is a product of white supremacy and white privilege.
Okay. Fair. He says, Africa. Although little or no African culture survives among American Negroes, the history of Africa is not without relevance to how and why masses of Africans came to be captured and sent to the Western Hemisphere as slaves. While the continent of Africa is larger than Europe, its coastline is not as long as that of Europe because Africa has few natural harbors indenting the coast. African rivers are also intermittently navigable according to terrain and season of the year. Dense jungles and vast deserts add to the difficulty of internal transportation and communication. Narrow coastal plains, bounded by cliffs and mountains, limited the size of coastal settlements. The net result has been a continent of highly fragmented and isolated peoples, speaking more than 800 languages and divided into a myriad of tribes. The political and military vulnerability of people in such conditions provided the opportunity for the mass enslavement by foreigners. Pause. All right. So
that's some real right there.
Yeah. So it's not a new idea. People always, mention how geography has more of a not people. He's the one that actually originally came up with the idea. But if you ever read the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond's white guy, he pretty much parodied the idea. He was talking about like the geographical reasons that led, just not that they led to the enslavement of black people, but they did not help Like some of the challenges that we had with the continent of Africa, just with this basic geography, did not help Black people come together. Did not help Africans come together. It led Africa to be a lot more fragmented.
Yeah, my wife, she's currently reading a book. Well, I'm listening to a book via audio that kind of, and I'm slipping on the title of the book, but it goes over the history of Black people dating all the way to, our first appearance, to, all our success in Egypt, to today, like throughout the world. And that book essentially echoed the same information, like the terrain and the difference in the geography throughout Africa definitely played a huge role in the fragmentation of Black people in Africa, and which resulted in the different cultures and so on, different languages. And that did make it a little, I guess, for lack of a better word, easier for them to become a target. So I definitely agree with that idea.
Yeah, and there's another book, I think it's a book on that Afghanistan, One Tribe at a Time. I forget if it's a book or a paper. I just remember reading it when I was going through civil affair trials. But it talks about, in Afghanistan, like they had the same challenge, and the issue is you have the same people, but on two different sides of a mountain. So over generations, they become very, fragmented, and they don't really look at each other as one people anymore. And then, like, what reason do you have to really go over a mountain? Like, the mountain gives you every reason not to go. You know what I mean? Like, not to trade with these people, not to. And over generations, they start their languages, their dialects, they change, and they
like when they fronted each other, like they considered each other completely different people. So that's why they had a lot of conflagration or conflict between different tribal groups in Africa, because they didn't recognize each other as just all being Black. They're like, we don't know these people.
Yeah, and what was just like, what you call that? If ubiquity, if you're someplace and it's almost like you're in a neighborhood and they have telephone lines, everywhere. Like on 147th and Sibley, you probably wouldn't even notice that. Well, it's probably the same way down in Louisiana where you see these telephone poles everywhere, but you don't notice the telephone poles when you're there because you see the telephone poles every day. So unless there was a difference, you'd have a reason to notice a difference. But if there is no difference in your skin tone, why should you even notice that as being a defining factor? Therefore, it becomes to the point it's not a thing. We're all Black. So I don't like you for I already found a different reason for not liking you. You see what I'm saying? It's not because you're not Black. Yeah, so blah blah the great civilizations of the African continent. Okay, that's compared too much. Okay, the great civilizations of the African continent arose with these geographic barriers were not so formidable. The 4,000-mile-long Nile River, mostly navigable, provided the economic and social basis for the ancient civilization of Egypt. Mediterranean ports and land routes to Asia also enabled the northern parts of Africa to develop larger and more complex nations than Africans south of the Sahara. The more united and powerful people of that region, the Arabs, became the first mass enslavers of African Negroes. All right, because you know that. So Spain got the idea of slavery or getting the slaves. The Spanish were some of the first ones that Europeans to have slaves, and they pretty much got that from their connects with the Arabs.
And you know what upsets me though? Like, first of all, there was only a small portion of the Nile that was actually utilized by like the African people within that area. But what upsets me is that like the African people of that time allowed for Asians or the Asiatic people and allowed for like the Arabs to come and like conquer them. And I know they may have had superior weaponry, and maybe that was the reason why they were able to be conquered. But I'm like, man, why didn't they push back more? Why did they,
This whole idea of I don't want to deflect from what you're saying, because what you're saying is true. We start talking about what Egyptians look like they may have been black, and they may have conquered black people south of the Sahara, and then maybe they were conquered by Arabs or Berbers or whatever else. But at the end of the day, I'm just going to go based off what I see today. If you go to Mauritania, there are still slaves in Mauritania today, and they're enslaved by Berber, North African, Arab people, and they are enslaving black people. Okay, and Europeans are against this 100%, and they've done everything they can to stamp it out. But when you're talking about the African continent, and you're talking about two peoples on the African continents, the Arabs and the Africans, well, I mean, that's between them, and there's only so much a European can do. And the other thing I wanted to say was the Sudan. If you look at the Sudan, you can say that's a pretty racially ambiguous country. It was the largest country in Africa. And then you had the whole Civil War. You had the break off where the Black Africans of the South developed South Sudan because they didn't want to be part of what they called the Arab North. But the funny part is these Arabs in the North look a lot like you and look a lot like me. They're lighter skinned brothers that happen to have a different cultural heritage because at one point they were conquered by the Arabs and mixed. So these are black people. When they're saying that the Janjaweed were coming on horseback and killing black Africans, these were black people killing black people. Sudan is a black country through and through. You know, it's not Libya, it's not Egypt, it's not Syria. The people in Sudan look like me and you, and they also look like Carl, and they're black, they're light, they're whatever. But you have some who call themselves something other than black because they have because they have an Arab culture and they speak Arabic. So this is something that it's more complex. Like they'll say, like when they were calling your boy, the guy who killed Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman, when they're saying he's a white guy, he wasn't white. And I wish we would stop. Or you can say he's a white supremacist, but he was not white. White people are not claiming George Zimmerman. You know what I mean? So we have to be able to realize that there are nuances to all these different.
He was white supremacist.
We can't just, when somebody wants to get us riled up, they just use this whole black and white dichotomy to get us polarized on one side or the other. And I think it'd be better and we'd be less quick to jump to racism if we realized and just identified the nuance it's really involved in supremacy, in skin supremacy, whatever you want to call it.
I definitely think it's important that we appreciate that. I also think it's important that we make a stark distinction between discrimination and someone being prejudiced and racism. Like, to me, there's a difference. Racism is, when you're oppressing a people on the basis of their color. But if someone, yells out to me, "Hey, blackie," or yells a derogatory term to me, they're not necessarily practicing racism, but they're just discriminatory to me. Now, I can make the assumption based off their actions that they're more than likely a racist and believe in racism and therefore oppressing black folks or black people just due to their skin content or color. But that's my assumption. It may not be true, but yeah, I think it's important that we make that distinction too, because every little thing that we see, every derogatory term that's used, the way people talk, doesn't absolutely equal racism. It could hint towards it and make the accusation or purport that that person is a racist, but you can't say with 100% certainty that that person is, practicing racism. They may just be ignorant or whatever.
For sure. What I did, I skipped ahead a few pages just so I'm not reading direct from the book. And maybe that'll make, how when they play music on YouTube, somebody rates some music, they don't just listen to the whole song, they got to break up. So I'm skipping ahead about 4 or 5 pages now. And I'm in Slavery in America. It says the United States held the largest number of slaves of any country in the Western Hemisphere. More than 1/3 of all slaves in the hemisphere in 1825 yet other countries actually imported more slaves. In Brazil, 6 times as many. So you get that. He's saying even though you had more slaves in America, the majority of the slaves did not come to America. So he breaks down why. He says the difference was the United States was the only country in which the slave population reproduced itself and grew by natural increase. Now, I'm going to pause right there. So the reason in Brazil, even though the people, hey, what's up, baby?
Yeah, my bad. Give me 1 second. You can sit down right here, man. That's good. All right, go ahead, cuz.
Yeah, even though, you know, if you look at the average Brazilian, genetically they're more mixed. They have, it seems like their culture is closer to Africa than our culture. Like they have more Africans in their culture, and that's because most of them have not been in America or in the Americas as long as we have. You know, we had a self-reproducing, self-increasing population in America, where the slavery in the southern America and the slavery in Caribbeans was more brutal and was people didn't live as long, so they had to import people more directly. And there was economic reasons for that. That's what he's getting at. I think he's going to say something about it. He says the conditions under which slaves were held were generally more brutal in other countries. However, they were brutal in the United States as well. Whippings were common. The sale of children away from their parents happened often enough to be a danger to constantly be feared. The forcible separation of husbands and wives also occurred with considerable frequency. About 1 out of every 6 couples. So 1 out of every 6 couples, married couples, was forcibly separated. Other cruelties and atrocities also, and not only that, he says that, but then he also has a footnote. So if you want to know what book to go to get that, get this. And it is, he read a book, or he's quoting a book by Herbert Gutman, The Black Family in Slavery and Freedom, 1750 to 1925. 1977. So that's why I say this guy is smart as hell, man, because he doesn't just say something without actually having the source that he got it from. Not saying that the source he got it from is infallible, but he's studied. All right, and he says other cruelties and atrocities, also sporadic, were inherent features in the institution of slavery and caprice in the slave owners. So caprice means like, you know what it means. It just means like whatever the fuck the slave owner, if he had a good day, it was good for you. If he had a bad day, it was bad for you. In nearly material terms, slaves in the United States were usually amply fed and with low quality food, and thus their housing, although primitive by today's standards, was comparable to or better than that of contemporary European peasants, workers. So pause, because I think that probably is going to surprise a lot of people. It says,
yeah. So did he say the housing of slaves was comparable to European peasants or workers? Europe was in dire straits at that point in time, though, in history. Like their living conditions were deplorable. It was like really bad.
Exactly. I think that's the point he's getting after. So he's saying the average lifespan of a 19th century American slave was slightly below that of whites in the United States, but the same is a lifespan in Holland and France, and greater than that in Italy or Austria. Slaves in the United States lived an average of 36 years. Peasants in Ireland, 19 years. To the slave owner, slaves were an investment and want to be safeguarded. For example, slave owners usually hired white workers, typically Irish immigrants, to do work considered too dangerous for slaves.
Oh, I would have to look at his. I see he put a footnote after that sentence.
So that is in Frederick Law Olmsted. So if you know Frederick Law Olmsted, he designed a lot of the great parks in Chicago. And he also designed New York Central Park. He designed Washington Park. So he traveled extensively in the U.S. I want to say Frederick Law Olmsted was actually from Europe, but he traveled in the U.S. and he was actually like an abolitionist. But he made a lot of basically he wrote a few books that were very detailed. Even I've looked some of these books up and I've read them, and he's legit. Like he talks about racism, he talks about all that, but at the same time, he's giving you a snapshot of what was actually happening at that time. So yeah, the lifespan of, go back to the thing. I'll read it again. He's saying that dangerous work and was often hired out, or almost always hired out, to work that was deemed too dangerous for slaves to do. Think about this. You spend $800, $1,600 on a person, and that's your property. Are you really going to allow that person to do something that's going to break their legs, or, you know what I'm saying, put them in a position where they're not able to work anymore?
Probably not. But when you force like slaves to procreate, you may use their posterity to do that type of work because they're essentially free. You get it? It's like it's truly free labor because you don't pay for their offspring. I mean, you may have to pay for their upkeep, and even that, you know, that may be minimal. So I would think that they would use the offspring of the slaves that they purchased to do like the more dangerous work because it's less of a loss.
Well, you know, anything's a possibility. But I would say that whatever he's saying, again, there's a resource, and we'd have to read that resource. It can get quite exhaustive. We could stop. We could also read the book he got this from. But let's take him at face value.
Okay.
For right now, but I would say let's write that down as something, or I'll highlight it as something that we could possibly not believe. This is where he says, for example, slave owners usually hire white workers, typically Irish immigrants, to do work deemed too dangerous. Review highlights. What the hell just happened? Wow, I think I lost my page. Slavery in America. Skip ahead one. The central feature of any slave system, preventing escape, was accomplished in the antebellum South, not by fences or guards, but by keeping the slave ignorant, dependent, and in fear.
That's true.
All right, so it's like you've seen the experiments that they would do with fleas, where they put them in a jar, and then they put the top on the jar, and the fleas will try to jump out of the jar, but as they hit their head, hit their bodies on the lid of the jar, they would only jump to a certain height. And when you remove the lid, they won't jump out of the jar. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's a mental thing. Getting back to what Kanye said, you know.
Yeah, they were definitely slaves who were mentally captivated and enslaved. Yeah.
So the overwhelming majority of slaves could neither read nor write, and most southern states made it a crime to teach them. Because slaves were kept in captivity by ignorance rather than by physical restraints, it was easy to escape a slave plantation temporarily, but very difficult to escape permanently. Patrols manned by local whites recaptured runaways and regulated or punished other slaves who were off the plantation for whatever reason.
Yeah, the U.S. Marshal wasn't playing.
Yeah, so they didn't have marshals at that time. They didn't have police or nothing, right? So they would actually.
No, they had U.S. Marshals, didn't they?
No.
The U.S. Marshal was actually. I thought that they were. It was started for that particular reason. Well, not that only that particular reason, but that was one of the major reasons why the organization was initiated. It was to catch like runaway slaves and to bring them back to their masters. And like, if like a slave was captured, let's say someone's captured a slave, if they did not return that slave to their master, they would actually have to pay a penalty. I forgot, it was like over $1,000 or whatever, which was costly during that time. And they could also face prison time. There was like a particular law that was put in place for that. But
Right.
yeah,
So
I thought the marshals were around.
most of the is my understanding that mostly in the South, and maybe because the government, the federal government in the South maybe didn't have that same reach at that time. They would pay local bands of people. Pretty much, you would like put on almost like a jury duty type thing. And this month, Dave, if any of these Negroes start running away, you and Antoine, it's your month to go out there and track them down. And a lot of times, me and you wouldn't own any slaves. We really didn't have any skin in the game, and we really didn't want to do that shit. We didn't want to track to the woods after people that we didn't have any interest in because we didn't own them. They weren't making us any money. As a matter of fact, they were our competition in a way, because we're also plantation farmers and whatever else. So that's the way I understood it. And I'm not sure if he's gonna. Okay, he does say something about it.
Yeah, because it says the oldest American federal law enforcement agency was created by the Judiciary Act of 1909 during the presidency of George Washington as the Office of the United States Marshal. What?
All right, so he says, what he says is the overwhelming of slaves could neither read or write, blah, blah, blah. Because slaves were kept in captivity by ignorance rather than physical restraints, it was easy to escape a slave plantation temporarily. Patrols manned by local whites recaptured runaways and regulated or punished other slaves who were off the plantation for whatever reason. And he says slaves were kept dependent on the slave owners for rations of food or clothing and for organization of their daily lives and living conditions. And think about that. And think about the welfare system where they want people living off the government. Why would they want people living off the government? Now, he's not going to get to that right now, but the slaves were dependent upon their masters for rations of food, clothing, and for the organization of their daily lives and living conditions. And I would say the same way we have Black people who are in the system today, who are in jail today, they get used to somebody feeding them. They get used to peeing when somebody tells them to pee, and shower when somebody tells them to shower, and come out the cell when they tell them to come out the cell. It just becomes part of them. They embody, that prison mentality of the prison life.
Yeah, that's why I wish we had like a true rehabilitation process in place when it comes to our prison systems to prevent that institutionalization. Because when they get out, they're not like compatible with society. So they all, they end up going back in, and there's a term for it. I'm slipping. Starts with the R. Oh my goodness.
Rehabilitation.
No, not rehabilitation. When
recidivism rate. Something like that.
Here we go. Recidivism.
Yeah. We're trying to use these words, man. I'll tell you what.
Yeah, I think that's why the recidivism or recidivization rates are extremely high. If that's correct. Yeah, I wish we had a true rehab.
We get each other. We understand each other. We know what the hell we're talking about. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's very true. Like these people become institutionalized, and when they get out, like you said, they become dependent on things, and it's tough for them to be independent and thrive on their own.
I'm skipping down just a little bit. Dependent, blah, blah, Okay, the philosophy and practice was observed during the celebrated travels of Frederick Law Olmsted through the South. Olmsted concluded that the Southern strategy was to try to train the slave to work and yet prevent him from learning to take care of himself. Yeah. Now, if we start talking about the slave mentality, I think I'm not talking for him, but I think that kind of sums it up. Prevent him from learning to take care of himself. Olmsted concluded that the Southern strategy was to try to train the slave to work and yet prevent him from learning to take care of himself. With many generations of discouragement, of initiative, and with little incentive to work any more than necessary to escape punishment, slaves developed foot dragging, work evading patterns that would remain as a cultural legacy long after slavery itself disappeared. Duplicity and theft were also pervasive patterns among antebellum slaves, and these too remained long after slavery ended. Among themselves, slaves had evolved some patterns for living. Racial solidarity was basic, and betrayal to whites was unforgivable. Even the slave driver, a slave immediately in charge of other slaves and authorized to mete out punishment, had to make his compromises within the framework. On large plantations, some house servants might form personal attachments to members of the white household, but they had to respect the line between internal differences among blacks and outright betrayal to whites. The black world was ultimately the only world in which slaves could find emotional fulfillment and close attachments, and to become a pariah there meant personal devastation. The norms of the slave community therefore carry weight, even without official sanction or institution to enforce them. Incest taboos, for example, were more widely observed among slaves than among the contemporary whites. Marriages between first cousins were common among white slave owners, but very rare among blacks, and keeping with differences in incest taboos between Europe and Africa. In short, the slave community had its own norms, which were not mere copies of white patterns. Even slave owners found it expedient to accommodate the wider incest taboos of blacks by allowing marriages between their slaves and slaves who lived on other farms and plantations, even when there were eligible mates by white standards in the slave plantation community. In one rare case of nuclear family incest, the slave owner was forced to sell a father who had made his daughter pregnant, for the other slaves had threatened to kill him. Pause. Thoughts?
That's right. No, I'll just
Yeah, so I mean,
hey, I think that and staying away from incest. I mean, we know that incest could lead to anomalies and chromosomal anomalies and things of that nature. So I think that's great, and I think that's pretty good that the white, slave owners did not force the issue. I mean,
well,
I would have to double check that to corroborate that that's true, but
so
but
we
if
can note that too.
I think that's good that they, actually allowed for them to practice this cultural idea of staying away from family incest.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's not so much they allowed them to, but it was like the things that we really stood for. Like, hell no, we're not. I'm not sleeping with my sisters for nobody. You know what I mean? When we stand on our morals, then nobody can force you. They didn't. I don't know if the white slave owners really had a choice without killing us, because there's some things you're not going to take. Like, they'll have to kill you because mentally you're just not going there, and there's other things you mentally fall into, and it's easy for them to, control you in that fashion.
I agree with that. Like, that was something that I don't think they could control. Like, yeah, they could control other aspects because, like, a lot of slaves could not. Most slaves couldn't read. Most slaves, were dependent in other areas on whites. But this was one thing that they really weren't dependent on whites with. And like you said, we were able to stand on that and realize that there was nothing that they can do about that.
Yeah.
Potentially, again, I would have to corroborate that, that the white slave owners actually allowed for them to practice this kind of idea or cultural idea against.
Okay, I'm gonna skip forward a little bit. I'm gonna try and see what's a good area to hop back in. Okay, sometimes slave marriages were forcibly terminated, usually by the sale of one of the partners. Most of these forcible terminated marriages had also lasted many years. The testimony of many former slaves told of the anguish these partings caused, and many slave owners were reluctant to part slave couples for fear that the remaining partner would try to escape. Still, nearly 1/6 of Mississippi blacks in 1864-65 had been forcibly separated from their spouse. After emancipation, many separated couples searched for each other for years. During slavery, there were instances of suicide after separation and murder of whites for raping a slave, although that meant sure death for the man who killed the rapist.
Yeah.
That there were hundreds of documented instances of slaves murdering whites for a variety of reasons also suggests that the enslaved people were not lacking in the values that were deeply felt. Pause. So I mean, and the sad part about this guy is, man, people think this guy is an Uncle Tom. You know, he's almost 90 years old. This guy is probably one of the smartest people in America, period. He's one of America's premier economists. And because of his political leaning and because of maybe his diction or the way he talks, he's been called Uncle Thomas Sowell.
I don't know. You probably haven't gotten me to the Uncle Tom parts of this book.
This is him. This is what. That's it. Like, I just gave you one, because a lot of black people said, man, wasn't no slaves murdering white people. There are hundreds of documented instances of slaves murdering whites for a variety of reasons, suggesting that the enslaved people were not lacking in the values that were deeply felt. Saying, okay, man, you see a woman get raped, you see this white man rape this black woman, they know we didn't just lay down and take that shit. Somebody killed that motherfucker.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there had to be some resistance. I mean, yeah, I would.
Well, they broke tools. They poisoned motherfuckers constantly. They outright grandma's told us stories of her uncles or her great uncles beating up a white man or killing a white man. I've heard those stories from grandma before she passed. You know what I mean? Like, yes, that shit was common. It wasn't an anomaly.
Yeah. The only unfortunate thing is they were wildly unsuccessful. But like, unsuccessful meaning they were unable to like gain freedom in their efforts. But yeah, I would definitely argue that there was probably a lot of that. It's probably a lot of resistance.
Yeah, but you're talking unsuccessful in like a plantation, like burning the plantation down and turning the system upside down. But right. we've already came to a point where we're saying no, they were mentally enslaved. There was no desire to burn the system down. Like, where did they have to go? If you're a 40-year-old man and you can't read or write and you're ignorant and you think this white man is greater than you, you're not trying to burn the system down. But when he hurts you, when he rapes your wife, now you'll kill him then. You see what I'm saying? And maybe,
I think that there were probably some people who were trying to overturn the system and take over. I mean, obviously they probably got to a certain point where they're like, all right, we take over the system, take over the plantation. Dang, where do we go from there? Like, how do we prevent other plantation owners or other whites from knowing that we took over the system, and what will be our end point and things of that nature? And I know that probably like engendered a lot of trepidation within them, but I think that there was some people who were probably willing to overturn the system.
Sure, and they were house slaves. They were house slaves. They were educated. Nat Turner was a house slave.
Yeah.
Denmark Vesey was a house slave.
Yeah.
It was another guy. The biggest slave revolt ever was somebody from Louisiana. He was a mixed guy. But he was, again, and I hate bringing up color, but Nat Turner was high yellow. Nat Turner was high yellow. He wasn't just light skinned. Nat Turner was high yellow. And that gave him his proximity to the whites. That's why the whites trusted him. That's why he was in the house. Just because in the movie he was dark skinned, all the reading I've done said that he was high yellow.
Yeah, I don't think colorism, yellow or dark purple.
The
you
reason I say
still
that matters,
consider black.
yeah. The reason I say that matters is because when we think about this idea of one, the house slave, and then we also think about this idea of, you know, who's gonna burn down the plantation. Well, if the field slaves were mentally stuck, let's just say stuck. Well, let's say it was just.
I don't think that all the field slaves were mentally stuck, though.
Okay, but I'm just saying, I'm gonna talk in generalities.
Okay.
And I'm doing it for a reason.
Okay.
The folks that had the closest proximity to the white folks, so the ones that maybe got to learn to read a little bit or could read the Bible, the ones that, as soon as you get the education portion, like there's some advantages to being light skinned. There's some advantages. You ever watched the movie Spook the Set by the Door?
Mm-hmm. I've heard of that movie.
Man, watch the movie, man. Watch that movie. It speaks to it in and of itself. One of the divisions that we have amongst ourselves, you know, and I think Malcolm X, he speaks about, you know, the house slave and the field slave, and I think a lot of people may have missed, because of that, they actually missed the point of, you know, who was actually causing these revolutions, who was actually causing these mass slave rebellions or whatever else. And then almost, if you read the personal accounts of each one, these were quote unquote house slaves.
You could also make the argument that, you know, some house slaves, because they had it good with the master, and they need to revolt. You know, so I think that throughout the spectrum, there were people who were resistant against the powers to be, and they wanted to move. They wanted a revolution. That means both dark skin and light skin.
Okay.
Those out in the field and those in the house. And I think there were also some individuals who want things to change, both in the field and also in the house. So I think like the shade of the skin color doesn't, like, I think that it was both types were present throughout the spectrum of Black folks.
Sure, but that's not the way it's sold, right? And I agree with you. Like, the skin color doesn't really matter, because you probably had some light-skinned slaves in the field. You probably had a lot of dark-skinned slaves in the house.
Yeah, and you may have dark-skinned slaves. I mean, I'm sure there were dark-skinned slaves in the field who actually knew how to read, and who were trying to teach like their offspring and their posterity how to read, or their neighbors how to read, things of that nature. Or some light-skinned slaves who went out to the field and taught some dark-skinned slaves how to read.
All right, I don't want to overemphasize dark and light skin.
Like, I'm pretty sure it was like an admixture of all that.
Yeah, and I didn't want to overemphasize the whole dark skin, light skin thing. I think it would be safer.
My wife right here, she wanted to jump in.
I just want.
Hold on one second, because she's breaking up. Just give it 1 second. She's breaking up. Hello? Uh-oh. Hold up. Dave. I hear you now.
Now, can you hear? Yeah, can you hear?
Yeah. I hear you now.
Oh, I was just saying, I can see how the light skin, I guess like Nat Turner and people who actually, that we know about, that had semi-successful slave revolts were pretty much light skinned, because they were not necessarily because they could read, but because they were in close proximity to the white people, and they knew their moves, and they could create counterattacks and be more, I guess, more tactical in what they're doing, because they kind of had an understanding of what the white people were doing and what was available to them.
Yeah, so I don't want to overemphasize the whole light skin, dark. So that wasn't my.
No, but it made sense though, and I didn't want it to seem like it was just because they were woke or something, or they had a different type of mentality because they were in the house versus the field. I think it was really just proximity, and they were able to better create counterattacks and attacks because of the information that they were privy to, just because they were in closer proximity to the white people.
That makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And then all types of slavery were bad, right? So if you were in the field and you're sleeping out in, you know, on grass, or if you're in the house and you're actually up in the attic, you know what I mean? So they would sleep up in the attic. The average attic is about 4 feet tall. So if you were any taller than damn 4 feet, you stooped over in the attic and you're eating all this man's food, you know, and you're so boss and you're cleaning the silverware, you know, doing all the extra stuff. I think you're gonna have a lot of resentment, especially if there's also people in the house are looking at you and saying, "This uppity nigga over here, just because he can read 10 words," you know. So it's like you're in a bad position either way. I wouldn't want to be out in the field. I wouldn't want to be in the house. I wouldn't want to be a slave. But I know this man's moves now. You see what I'm saying? So I don't think we've changed that much in time. Only reason I brought up his skin complexion was because that's a little known fact. Like when he's portrayed as a dark-skinned person, which is fine because there's plenty, you know, they portrayed Martin Luther King like he was yellow. Like there's no way. And at the end of the day, who knows for sure, right? Because we're just going off of what somebody else is saying. But I think when we start thinking about the house slave, maybe we need to also just light skin, dark skin, the house slave. That house slave also had some decisions to make, and they also played in the emancipation of Black people.
Absolutely.
That Uncle Tom, i.e. Uncle Thomas Sowell, whatever else, played a big part in the emancipation of Black people.
Hey, I want to get a personal thing out, if that's okay. I know we're everything. Man, did you know growing up, I used to wish I was more dark skinned?
Yeah, that's good.
You know, Carl Jordan, they're like dark skinned and stuff. And my mom, you know, my chocolate drops, this, that, and the third. And I used to be like, man, I'm like this caramel and stuff. Like, used to go out in the sun, man, try to increase my pigmentation.
Ain't nothing wrong with that, man. You know, hey, but you know what? The funny part about skin color, man, was growing up with a family that has so many different colors.
That's true.
And growing up in Chicago, where you know you see all types of people. It's not like growing up in South Carolina or something like that. It's to the point I didn't really notice it until I went to the military, and I was on Malcolm X shit at the time, man. And I was talking. It was we were having this whole talk about racism in basic training, and I was standing up talking to the Italian commander, and I was telling her, you know, how we weren't going to take this shit of Black people, of the good Black people of Bravo 135. We're not going to say, you know. And after that, man, I had a couple of Black guys from South Carolina. They cornered me and said, one of them said, "Hey, man, you can't talk for us, man."
What?
You can't talk for us. And I said, why not? He said, man, because you're not really Black.
Man.
That's the first time I really noticed it. Like, of course, it was things said like in high school or whatever else. People make comments, and you know, you so young, whatever. But
you're not even like Drake yellow though.
I'm like Drake yellow, dog. I don't.
You're not Drake yellow, man. You're like, you know, you just made light skin. Well, it depends on who you talk to, though. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean. But the color thing, that's a whole nother thing. But then,
oh, that's ridiculous. You should definitely host a vlogcast about that, about colorism, man.
Yeah, we will.
Yeah.
But you can tell. So just a little bit, I read out his book today, though, man. We discussed. And
I like it.
He's solid. But the thing is, with this book is he went through every ethnic group in America. So he doesn't talk about Blacks, doesn't talk about, you know, Irish, doesn't talk about the Japanese, doesn't talk about Mexican Americans, Hispanics, and all of them is like fire. He's just hitting you with facts. And what I figured out from reading this book was, damn, you know, we have a history in America But we don't have the only history in America. Like there's a wide variety of different experiences, and none of them were really, you know, a cakewalk.
Yeah.
Which and he doesn't have to water down. He did not water down slavery, but at the same time, he lets you know that, you know, Black people had some level of individualism, even in slavery. They had some level of right and wrong, and look, you're only going to push me so far before I kill you.
Do you think like us recognizing that will kind of inspire us to realize that we have some, even like today, we have some control over outcomes of our lives, of our being here in this country, of, you know, our success and what we can do and things of that nature? You think like being able to conceptualize this idea that like, yo, when we were enslaved, you know, yes, things were horrible. Yes, a lot of us were mentally enslaved, but we did have some sense of self, you know, some fight within us, some sort of identity, and like recognizing that, conceptualizing that, like we'll realize even today, you know, that we can better ourselves, we can do better. Do you think that?
I think that's it, man. I think the biggest thing is when he talks about the families and how 1/6 of Black families were forcibly separated in 1864 and 1865 in Mississippi. And today, Black divorce rate, or unmarried, unwed mother rate, those that are never married, whatever else, is something like 70%. So after slavery, they were walking up and down country roads looking for their spouse, you know, and don't let that be lost either. Like, we may have been more together. Not saying so the institution of slavery was anything right with that, right, but we may have had our shit more together, our family unit more together at that time.
Man, that's another good vlogcast that we can have, like the kind of degradation or debasement of the Black family, like what led to that, why we're in the current situation that we're in, and like how we can turn it around and, you know, improve our Black families. Because that is interesting. You know, you pointing out the fact that even during enslavement, there was a sense of like family, and they recognized the importance of that. There was an emphasis on that. And they attempted to protect that. Like, hey, what happened to that value within our, you know, our community?
Yeah, and that's the I think that's the big, what's the word I'm looking for? Bamboozlement.
Yeah.
Is maybe it's the family.
Yeah.
You know, so we gotta continue to discuss this, man. But for anybody who's out there that doesn't know this author, I don't know. I think he at least has 20 different books. This book is called Ethnic America, and it's one of his better ones. If I had to rate all of them, it's probably like in the top 10. It's in the top half of them, definitely. But read Black Rednecks, White Liberals.
Is that a more recent book of his?
I don't know when that was. I think that one might have been written in the mid-90s.
Okay.
So it's older. But you know, if something is true, like it's true forever, man. Like he also wrote a book called Conquest and Culture. He read another book that's good, but I'm gonna tell you, he also uses a lot of big words, and sometimes I get lost in what the hell he's talking about. It's a book called Knowledge and Decisions.
Okay, so you gotta have your thesaurus right next to you.
That's a slow read, bro.
Hey, you know what? I know it's more for pedantics, but like I like the idea of expanding my diction. I know that's kind of like, you know, it's not absolutely necessary or whatever. You can talk to people straight and stuff, but I don't know. It's probably Right, a little highfalutin or arrogant of me, but
what's the other word you always use? Pecuniary. I said, what the fuck does pecuniary mean? I'm gonna look this word up. Yeah, use that word like 10 damn times, and each time I don't know what the hell he's talking about. Pecuniary. Now I know. Having to deal with money.
Oh man.
No, that's good, man. I'm not even gonna knock that. Like I agree with you, honestly. But the thing with me, man, my memory is horrible. A lot of times, man, I'm like, what the hell is that word I want to use? And by the time I'm thinking about the word I want to use, the moment is gone. Like, all right, just move on, say something simple. That's my biggest issue. So I've been trying to make what I'm saying actually more basic now, just so I can get out my thoughts.
That's probably best anyways, because like people can receive that and understand that better. Like
that's definitely the issue that Donald Trump is having, right? I think he's a really smart guy. I think his issue is he's thinking about the big word. He's like, what the fuck would I say? You know what? It's really big. It's really great. It's outstanding. That's simply outstanding. You know,
it's tough for him though, because he's up against like these, you know, Harvard grads, Columbia grads that excelled and were like the top of his class. Like these are like our prior presidents, with the exception to George Bush Jr. You know, he was kind of like an average Joe, and that's what was appealing, you know, about him. Like a lot of people could connect with him because he wasn't like within this, you know, high stratosphere type group. But yeah, I can understand that with Trump. Like it's tough, you know. Yeah. President Obama was top of his class. You know, he was stellar when it came to academics. He's an excellent communicator. He can effectively convey his messages, and he knows how to like modulate, you know, his like how he communicates depending on who his audience is. So he can connect with like, you know, average Joes, but then also can, you know, connect with like those individuals who are considered scholars and things of that nature. So, you know, I think Trump should just be him, you know, and that's what he's doing. Really, that's what he's doing. He's like,
yeah, and yeah. You be you, and also like you could be smart and not use big words or not talk well. Like some people are like really good with math, and like they can you know, solve all the world's issues through math if you just give them a moment to think about it mathematically, but they can't speak for anything. You got other people who are great communicators, a lot of rappers or whatever else. You talk to T.I. or something like that, he's a dumbass. But man, can this dude talk? You know, like talking real fast and real loud, but not saying a damn thing. They just be wrong about everything. So I mean, like it goes both ways, I think. And then every once in a while, you get somebody who has both of the qualities. They can talk, and they're also, you know, well thought out or whatever else. But there's a certain amount of effort you have to put into that. I think the art of communication, you can be an effective communicator and not talk well.
Yeah.
And I think that I'm probably more in that camp than anybody else.
No, I think you talk well. You talk well and you effectively communicate your thoughts and ideas. I don't, you know, I definitely think, I'm not trying to knock our president, but I definitely think you know, communicate much better than him. By far.
Yeah. Well, I'll take that. I'll take that. That's a sideways comment, but a sideways compliment. I appreciate it. This is my president.
Right. At the end of the day, man, I want to see Trump succeed. Because if he succeeds, that means we're doing better as a country.
We all succeed. He succeed, man. Especially if he can get the black. If he can get the black underclass, because you know you have black folks and you have a black underclass also. And if we can make things better for the underclass, meaning that hey, he gets more factory jobs in or whatever else, and just gets more people back to work.
Yeah.
Then that's gonna drive down all the other bad indicators for us, you know.
Absolutely. It's gonna be tough getting them factories back open though.
Yeah. So yep, and that's where I'm gonna end this podcast, man. But the whole I'm gonna end the blog, but just hold the line for a moment. So this has been Logical Conclusion. Want to thank everybody who's viewed this video. Go ahead, hit the like, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, follow me, and you'll get more discussions like this. We'll give you bits and pieces of different books. We'll do some books on the left. We'll do some books on the right. We'll do some books down the center. But we'll break down what we read. Okay? Signing off.